Y hoy tenemos a alguien que viene de la academia, pero como ella misma me dijo, de una academia diferente. No es una investigadora como tal, es una persona que ha estado participando mucho en la representación de con su tribu, que ha trabajado mucho desde lo local, digamos, y ahora desde lo internacional, ¿no? Porque es la presidenta de la Sociedad Internacional de Etnobiología. Entonces voy a leer su semblanza. A ver, es la doctora Verna Miller. Es licenciada en Artes con una doble especialización en Geografía y Estudios Ambientales por la Universidad de Victoria. Obtuvo una maestría en Educación por la Thompson Rivers University con el proyecto Formas Indígenas de Enseñanza y Aprendizaje en el Contexto de la Cultura, la Teoría Entrelazada. Ha trabajado para su comunidad como directora de Mix Research, estuvimos practicando y nunca me salió, un grupo de investigación indígena con intereses etnobiológicos, derechos del agua, títulos y derechos, paisajes culturales, sagrados y arqueología. En 2004 fue nombrada como facilitadora de proyectos para la Sociedad de Sanidad y Sanación del Pueblo de los Nalapamuk, tampoco me salió muy bien creo, para brindar consejería mental y espiritual a las víctimas de las escuelas residenciales. Ha sido miembro de varios consejos de administración de organizaciones indígenas locales y ahora presidenta de Nalakapuj Child and Family Service Society. En 2006 fue seleccionada para ir a Tailandia para ser miembro del Comité de Ética de la Sociedad Internacional de Etnobiología y ella es actualmente la presidenta de la Sociedad Internacional de Etnobiología. Estábamos platicando sobre lo que convenía presentar, lo que ella quería presentar, y en su programa dice la etnobiología en el mundo, pero ella quiso agregar esta parte desde la visión de los indígenas, ¿no? Más que una presentación, lo que van a ver ahora es, lo que van a escuchar ahora es un mensaje que ella les va a dar, tómenlo, ¿no? Como alguien, como una abuela que les habla, y después vamos a ver unas fotos de ella. Entonces, pues sin más, Verna, que está...
I'm going to apologize first that I don't speak Spanish. I know the important words like bathroom and yes and no, but unfortunately, I have a hard time speaking my own language and English, never mind learning something else. Homet, we can find you to Laya, and Joan Squash Pipesa, can have Tlakush with La Timusha and Tlakapunk. Slin spepza squashed Dwairelst, Slin Yaya Kaza squashed Hamalch, Slin Spap, sorry, Slin Skatza squashed Schmumpla, Derek squashed Slin Skigra, Aka Azok, Utken Ha, Zokush. What I'm telling you is a traditional way of presenting myself by telling you what my name is, Bipetla, which means frog woman, big voice, little pond. I come from the Intlakepam Nation in the southern interior of British Columbia, Canada. We call ourselves the Intlakepam, and that is the part of our Temuch, as we call it, our land. I'll describe that later on in my presentation. Protocols from my homelands insist that I acknowledge the peoples, the indigenous peoples, on whose traditional homeland this conference is taking place. I don't know who they are or where they are, but it is important in my culture to make these acknowledgements. I was raised traditionally by my paternal grandparents until I was sent to one of the Indian residential schools in Canada, places that have been dishonored due to the multiple abuses that took place in those schools. However, I survived, mostly intact, because I'm one tough old broad. I have been married to my long-suffering husband for over 52 years, and have 2 sons and 2 grandchildren. I did not start my academic career until I was in my 40s. And at that time, I held a Bachelor of Arts degree with a double major in geography and environmental studies at the University of Victoria. Much later, much later, when I was in my 60s, I earned a Master of Education from Thompson Rivers University. And the title of my capstone paper was Indigenous Traditional Teaching and Learning Methods in a culturally relevant context. And the subtitle is The Braided Theory. Everybody know what braiding is? I wish I could share it with you, but it's too long. I have worked in my own community in various management positions in Indigenous research, and by that I mean that as Indigenous people, we're usually studied by outsiders. In this case, we studied ourselves within context and worked a lot with our elders that were still alive at the time. We looked at traditional uses such as hunting, fishing, spiritual sites and their meaning. I also managed other positions in mental and physical health. I just want to expand a little bit on the research part of my work. The major reason for bringing this research forward from an Indigenous perspective was that we were having difficulties with the timber extraction industry, forestry. We depend on our forests still to this day for aspects of our culture, our food, our medicine, our technology or materials, and our spiritual, ceremonial and art processes. The methods being used by forestry were being carried out without care and consideration to the non-timber forest products that we continue to depend on. The clear-cut forestry practices compromised spiritual sites, for example. They were taking away our access from a spiritual site to access to water, because our spiritual, I can't say religion because it's not a religion, but our spiritual way of life always depends on access to water. The other part of this was the trails were being compromised because the logging industry would cut down trees and we weren't able to find those specific landmarks. These networks would be comparable today to the complexity of the modern technological networks of today. I also continue to serve on several boards in our community and internationally, and at one time I actually served on a board of governors for our local university. Now I have to tell you, at this stage of my life, in my 70s, I have failed retirement because I continue to support my community in many different roles. Now to the beginnings. When I first got involved in anything of ethno studies, it was ethnobotany. And this is thanks to the mentorship of my good friend, Dr. Nancy Turner of the University of Victoria. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with her, but we affectionately call her the mother of ethnobotany and ethnoecology. And at one time, when I first found out about this book she wrote, I bought 8 copies. And I kept hoarding them. And this one copy that I used all the time when I was out in the field, when I was teaching lessons, giving guest lectures, etc., started to look like the cats had played with it, because it's all over the place now. And the other books I managed to find younger interested members in my extended family, so I was giving them out to those young people. I've had the opportunity to share this knowledge along with my own experiences that I remember from the time I spent with my grandparents. A lot of this was done locally, and a lot of times it involved a lot of hiking up in our mountains and on our dry desert-like valley. Where I come from is we call it the desert or dry desert interior. We have cactus, we have rattlesnakes, we have coyotes, sage. So I wouldn't like to compare it to your ecology here, but if you look at it on a miniature scale, because our cactus is about the size of my thumb, and then I see your cactus is like this, and I'm thinking, whoa. One of the interesting things about the ecology of my area is that there are little eco-niches where if you're up in the mountains, you'll see certain plant life and certain little kinds of ecologies that I often find down in our dry desert valley, and it's usually on the north-facing slopes because they don't get the sun of the rest of the dry desert-like area. I have to admit freely to you that my personal approach to ethnobiology is unconventional, in that I do not ascribe fully to Western scientific methodologies, and I hope not too many of you are disappointed to hear that. I cannot speak to ethnobiological issues without incorporating ethnoecology, for example. My approach is based on lived experience, observation, and those experiences and memories I have growing up with my traditions and my paternal grandparents' teachings. The indigenous scientific worldview we look at in the world, let me start over again. In the indigenous scientific worldview, we look at the world in a more holistic manner and understand the importance of symbiotic relationships at all levels. For example, I cannot overemphasize the importance of fire in assisting oil amendment and enhancement for the forage quality of our ungulates, for we depend on those ungulates for our food, clothing, and materials. The quality of our foods, medicines, material, and spiritual ceremonial uses depend on fire for the carbon needed for continuous abundance, such as berries, tubers, leaves, medicinal plants, materials derived from our plant and animal world, spiritual spaces that combine all elements and the art incorporated within. We continue to utilize all these aspects within our environment. Our elders continue to emphasize that the land, or tumich as we call it, and when I say tumich, I'm not just talking about the land. The expression tumich is very intimate to our people. I remember my grandmother, as we were growing up, whenever we'd travel somewhere, she would give praises to the tumich, saying how wonderful it is that it provides for us. And that incorporates everything in our homelands, not just the land. They're all important. It is our department and grocery store, our medicine cabinet, and our place of spiritual comfort. This holistic view also incorporates the symbiotic relationships between and among plants, humans, animals, and the four elements: earth, wind, water, and fire. We continue to give praise to the four elements, for without them we would no longer exist. Our mantra is that the pure water is the lifeblood of survival, and without all of these elements we would cease to exist. And I think that is true when we look at the state of the world today and how important these elements are to us as people, and the work that you as academics and researchers do to try to preserve some of those indigenous concepts and thoughts to try and keep us in balance. Now, my beginnings with the International Society of Ethnobiology, that relationship started in 2006 when I got a call from another good friend of mine, Dr. Kelly Bannister, whom I met at several North American ethnobiology conferences. She invited me to Chiang Rai, Thailand, to be part of an international group of indigenous peoples to develop the code of ethics for the ISE. I'm going to say ISE instead of International Society of Ethnobiology. And from the indigenous perspective, so we gathered together indigenous people from around the world to develop the code of ethics from our perspective as the collaborators. And I'll tell you now, I do not like the word informer. It makes me feel like a criminal, like that I'm telling on my people. And I refuse to let anybody call me an informer. Anyway, I wonder if you can guess why. The reason for this exercise was to level the playing field. Do you know what I mean when I say level the playing field? Do you want to describe that? Yeah, but I will give you an idea. You have a soccer team in Morelia, don't you? You have it. Okay. What would happen, do you think, if the FIFA champions from Germany came over to play with your team? Would that be a level playing field? Would it be fair? No, because your team would probably get beat up. I don't mean to insult the team. I'm sure they're excellent, probably better than any soccer I ever played. Does that make sense when I say level playing field? Okay, good, thank you. So this was to level the playing field between the academics, researchers, students, lawyers, policymakers, and community leaders that work alongside the indigenous peoples and traditional communities. The reason I'm adding traditional communities is because there are still in some areas, like Europe, traditional communities that exist today that continue on with their way of life, much like indigenous people. So from the indigenous perspective, this was to protect, first of all, our intellectual knowledge, property rights, and wisdom against those who would copyright information and language in context of their colonial culture. So, and that's been happening quite a bit. And I was just talking to Paulo here about a famous anthropologist by the name of Franz Boas. Have you ever heard of him? Yeah. Franz Boas tried to work in my traditional homelands, and our people did not like his approach, because what he was doing is he was taking the information from us and putting it into context of his culture, and it did not meet. He talked about our mythology like Greeks, and that's not how our mythology works. Our mythology is much deeper and more complex. I can tell you from personal experience that the relationship between the Academy and the indigenous collaborators has not always been stellar, and I just give an example of that. And I understand why sometimes that happens, because there is this, the Academy has this policy of publish or perish. So I'm going to give you now an example of how copyright infringes upon my people. Now, this was several decades ago that a dictionary of our language was produced, and it's like that. Half of it is made up of the North American linguistic expressions, which none of us can read. The other half are a dictionary of words first given in English, and then they would give the Intlekep word using the North American orthography. We can't figure out this orthography. You have to have classes in how to read your own language. And the problem with that is that it changes the nuances of the language using this orthography or any other orthography. And the strangest story I ever heard was one of our fluent speakers was in on trying to learn how to use this orthography. And when he started to speak, the professor said, "You're saying it wrong." Can you imagine the cheek of that individual telling my fluent speaker, "You're saying it wrong." He just threw up his hands in disgust and said, "You can't tell me how to speak my own language. I know it better than you." And it shut her down. So as a result of this dictionary, this copywritten dictionary, we can't make any changes, acknowledge new information, add any new words, make additions. We can't even make a copy of this thing. And in my mind, that is like holding me prisoner against the advancement of my language. Today, though, we're a bunch of rebellious people, I think, because we're going to take that dictionary apart and copy it anyway. Now, the lady who's the surviving member of the two, her and her husband basically put this together. She wants us to have this, but legal issues are making it very difficult for us to take over that copyright. So it's going to be a bit of a fight for a while. Now, getting back to the Code of Ethics, the most important topic of discussion on the Code of Ethics exercise was the differences in understanding information in context of language, culture, and social structures. We have been set upon by a colonial system that has no flexibility for the understanding of developing long-term relationships with collaborators. I can't stress this enough, and I'm going to keep repeating it. Those of us who are collaborators have detected the lack of respect and patience in some cases. There has been a lack of meaningful compensation on the part of the researcher to the collaborator. And by this, I mean something that is tangible and much needed in the community of study. For example, instead of monetary compensation, possibly good quality school supplies for children. If we have time at the end of this, I want to explain to you why monetary compensation was the worst thing that the Canadian government ever did for Indigenous people. Remind me. Developing long-term relationships with your collaborators and following local protocols must be adhered to and is critical if you want the cooperation needed for good, comprehensive, receptive, respectful research overall. Remember this, as a researcher, as an academic, your credibility is on the line. I would like to think that the days of the hit-and-run researcher are a thing of the past. And I'm going to tell you a little story about why the hit-and-run researcher didn't work out so great. When my father was still alive, in about his late teens, early 20s, he was well known for capturing wild horses or mustangs, because they were abundant in our area. He would go up into the mountains by himself. He would pick out the lead mare and the lead stud, and he would capture them. I don't know how his methods worked. That was sort of something he wouldn't tell anybody. But when he captured those two, the lead mare and the lead stud, he would get the rest of the herd to come in and he would tie them all together. And I remember my grandfather telling me this story because he was the one that was so proud of the way his son was able to capture horses. He said, here was your father coming down the street, a stud on one side, a mare on the other, and holding them down as he's walking down the street to bring them into the corral so he could start training them. Well, some researcher had found out about this and made arrangements to interview him and set up a time and date without any input from my father. Of course, Dad, being the smart, perceptive person he was, started wondering how this was going to happen without getting to know him first. The individual arrived and without any protocols, processes, anything, proceeded to question my father. This was not how my dad operated. So, as he put it, I lied through my teeth, told him what he wanted, what I thought he wanted to know, with all these embellishments, and sent him on his way. My father never heard from him again. but was not a bit concerned. Now, to date, there's never been any evidence of that interview ever took place. And I must also let you know that, of course, my father was a great storyteller too. I give you this dubious illustration as a cautionary when dealing with collaborators. Get to know them. Develop a relationship that could be long-standing. Understand their protocols, their worldview. In other words, you have to, as a researcher and academic, you have to remove yourself from yourself and try to look deep into what the collaborators' worldview is. Get into their heads, understand them a lot better. That way you will have more credibility when ego is diminished. Look at the world of the collaborator outside your own colonial concepts you hold. Be mindful that you come from a place of power, and it is easy to take advantage of collaborators who are not familiar with your world. So this basically is the way that we were trying to develop these codes of ethics after having all of these discussions about the issues that we on the Indigenous world platform have had those kinds of problems. Now, in 1988, which is 30 years ago this year, the ISE was initiated from the Declaration of Belém. And the leadership of Dr. Darrell Posey, who was from Louisiana State University and then later, I believe, Oxford University in England, he was an ethno-entomologist, but during his work in the Amazon, he morphed his work into a broader scope as he worked with the collaborators in the Amazon. He came to understand, I think, that his research was too focused on one topic as he made observations of the Indigenous people and their interaction and intimacy with the world they lived in. He began to understand that their world was much more complex and had been ignored in conventional science. To illustrate this, I'm going to read a passage from one of his papers that will emphasize how one worldview differs from another and why understanding this is critical for a differing worldview. I believe this paper is going to go in the conference proceedings, so the reference to that will be in there. Dr. Posey talked about how he came to understand why it's easier to mount campaigns to save species than efforts to save or salvage endangered peoples. So this is what he learned. My first lesson came when I went to Xingu River Indian Post in Cocrajmoro. There was very little meat in the village for some time, and the Indians were anxious to kill some game animals. A hunting trip was mounted, and I was invited to participate. After most of the day in the forest, we were fortunate enough to kill a sizable tapir. A large hunk of meat was brought back to the cabin where I was staying. It was processed by rubbing the meat with salt and storing it in a bowl of brackish water in a dark storage room. The cabin residents left to go downriver, promising to return within 2 days. I was asked to keep an eye on things, which I gladly did. After 5 days, however, I found myself still alone in the cabin, and I decided to go into the back room to look at our meat. To my horror, I discovered the meat covered with fly maggots. I was originally trained as an entomologist and do not actually have anything against fly maggots, but that does not mean they are good for meat. Who would eat spoiled meat? I reasoned, and then threw out the noxious mess. Several Indians from the neighboring cabin happened by, saw the meat being thrown away, looked at me strangely, asked for the meat, which I gladly gave them, and they meandered off looking quite pleased. I was not quite sure why. The next day, my hosts arrived from their prolonged journey. They were hungry for tapir meat and immediately asked about the tapir. I said, Well, it was full of maggots, and I threw it out. What? The head of the household exclaimed angrily. He threatened to throw me out of the cabin. Some maggots, it seems, as they grow, exude enzymes which help break down the more gristly parts of the meat. They look awful, but do a great service. One has only to remove the maggots with a good washing to find a very nice tender piece of meat that is much more edible than before processing. So I just give you this example of how your mindset may not understand the mindset or the processes that Indigenous people use. And I thought it was a great example for how your mindset can change to understand better what Indigenous and traditional peoples, how they live, basically. The ISE was developed as a global collaborative network of individuals and organizations working to preserve vital links between human societies and the natural world. Although we are focused on the studies of ethnobiology, there are other disciplines to consider that are combined within: conservation, biocultural diversity, as mentioned, intellectual property and resource rights, ecology, applied ethics, and now climate change, and how Indigenous traditional communities are having to adapt. The major concern first identified by Dr. Posey, and hence the background to the ISE, was that he feared the loss of traditional, local, and Indigenous knowledge and the effects of the loss of biological, biological, cultural, linguistic diversity on the world. It is too easy for those of us living in this cosmopolitan world to give credence to the knowledge keepers of the biological diversity of our world. Now, I have been very fortunate to meet a gentleman by the name of Dr. Gleb Netsky. Have you ever heard of him? He has written an amazing book called The Archipelago of Hope. And I believe it's already translated into Spanish. If you can get a hold of that book, it's an incredibly invigorating read about his work with the people, the people in the Yamal Peninsula of Russia. They are the reindeer herders, and they have noticed a great change in their processes for migrating to and from the tip of the Yamal Peninsula where they take their reindeer to feed. He also worked in the more, I think in the eastern part of Russia where he originally came from. He's also worked in the Amazon and heard their stories of their struggles with the big corporations that are, the greedy corporations that want all the benefits of what's under the ground, the oils, the minerals, etc. And he's also worked in Canada with a young fellow that I know who is looking at making tribal parks of areas that we want to protect because we don't feel that the Canadian government is protecting enough of our homelands. Anyway, if you ever get a chance to read his book, it's amazing. And now down to the Ise Code of Ethics. I'm going to try to summarize what the Ise Code of Ethics reflects in its vision. There are definitely issues of ethical decision-making, the conduct for ethnobiological research and related activities, and how to facilitate ethical conduct and equal partnering relationships. I refer back to the comment of meaningful collaboration and responsible reciprocity by everyone. The Code of Ethics is on the ISE website, by the way, and has been translated to many languages, including Spanish. I think actually Spanish was the first language that it was translated into. The fundamental value underlying the Code of Ethics speaks to the concept of mindfulness, self-evaluation. How do you see yourself? How are you mindful of what you're doing? And how the Academy evaluates itself in understanding actions, and responsibilities to your collaborators and their respective communities. In the past, researchers have done the research without consent of their subject communities, and I've had experience with that as well. The Code of Ethics acknowledges that biological and cultural harms have resulted from research undertaken without the consent of Indigenous and traditional peoples. It affirms the commitment of the ISE to work collaboratively in ways that support community-driven development of Indigenous peoples' languages and cultures. It acknowledges Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights, protecting the inextricable linkages between culture, linguistic, and biological diversity, and contributes to positive, beneficial, and harmonious relationships in the field of ethnobiology. Excuse me. The Code of Ethics goes further as it applies to all research collections, databases, publications, images, audio and video recordings, or other products of research and related activities undertaken, especially that which concerns collation and use of traditional knowledge or collections of flora, fauna, or other elements of biocultural heritage found on community lands or Indigenous territories. Now this is very important because I'm sure you're all aware of products derived from Indigenous knowledge. And this is one of the things that we're trying to work around to figure out how, instead of a corporation, like the Body Shop, if you're familiar with that, what are they doing to compensate the knowledge that they derived in order for them to make these profits from these products that they're building? Why and how much profit is going back to that Indigenous community or that Indigenous group? So these are the things that we're struggling with. How do we take people to task for what they do? I know in this world of academia and research, there are a lot more ethical ways of operating than, say, some corporate entity. There's a huge drug company in the United States called Shaman Pharmaceuticals. And there's other pharmaceutical groups as well that take knowledge from Indigenous people and profit from it without any compensation or sharing with the Indigenous people they got this information from. Later on, Leo's going to put some photos up there, and the Ise Code of Ethics website is on there, so you'll be able to get that. There are 17 principles, 12 practical guidelines, and a glossary of terms in the Code of Ethics. The principles and practical guidelines are based on the concept of traditional resource rights and compliance standards set by international laws, policies, and customs. These ethics are intended to support and enable processes, but not override community-level processes, protocols, methodologies, which may not always adhere to the way you do your business. So there has to be that discussion and that respect from your part to understand why Indigenous and traditional peoples do things differently than you. Now, there's one thing that we have run into with the Code of Ethics, in that different countries will understand the Code of Ethics in different ways. And that's not to say that everyone uses these ethics appropriately. And this is a struggle we've been having, because you can explain the Code of Ethics to people, but you're not out in the field with them, say, in India or in Africa. So you don't know if those codes of ethics are being followed to the letter the way that we here in North America or South America would do. So that's kind of a dilemma we're trying to figure out right now. Now, as far as perspectives for the future of the ISE, It has certainly had its opportunities and its challenges. This term as president has been one of transitions and a bit of uncertainty, but I hope we will continue in the resilient way that Dr. Posey would have done. We have had more Indigenous and traditional communities attending the congresses, and there have been frank discussions between researchers and collaborators to help bring a greater understanding and, in some cases, taking the Academy to task and challenging concepts on a variety of issues. We congregate in Belém this August, and by all accounts will prove to be a successful and enthusiastic Congress. Hopefully, we can iron out a new way of operating now that our funds have run out. We did have a Christensen fund for about 5 years, I think, that sort of enhanced, but now we don't have that administrative support anymore. However, we did manage without these funds before, so I'm sure we will carry on. The main focus is to ensure participation of the knowledge holders of Indigenous and traditional communities at these congresses. And up to the time of the Christensen funds, it was very rare to see an Indigenous person at these meetings. And the Congress revolves around that relationship with Indigenous people. If you don't have Indigenous people there, why bother? So each Congress makes a point of trying to find out where those Indigenous people are and bring them, listen to their perspective. So I'm just going to conclude, and I hope I've given you a reasonable synopsis of my involvement with the ethnobiology, and with particular emphasis on my experience in this world of ethnobiology, but from an Indigenous perspective, and my involvement with the ISE. I cannot emphasize enough to all of you the importance of the Code of Ethics and what it means for building those critical relationships with your collaborators. My own personal experience throughout my life has grounded me in many of our Inklakapan traditions and knowledge, and I hope that I've been able to express myself without too many missteps. I would like to bring to your attention here the 30th anniversary of the Declaration of Belém and the initiation of the ISE Congress. It is being held in Belém, Pará, Brazil, this August 6th to the 10th. And lastly, I would like to thank you, the Congreso, I'm hoping I'm saying this right, Congreso Mexicano de Etnobiología and the Red Temática de Sistemas Agroforestales de México for this wonderful opportunity by inviting me here to participate with you. My heartfelt thanks. I'm just going to explain this photo to you. That big mountain there, if you look over to the far corner, that's where I grew up, on the other side of the river. Right now you see this bridge. Can you still hear me if I get away from the microphone? That mass of wave right there, it came away from the mountainside and ran right into the river and killed some of my people that lived on the other side. Some survived, some didn't, but it was a big mudslide, and it changed the face of the mountain a bit, mainly the lower half. And that bridge is about the 4th bridge they've had to build because the river gets very high in Frechette, and it kept washing away all the bridges. There was a ferry there at one time prior to building the bridges, but the bridges, they couldn't build them high enough at that time. But now we're down to 1 bridge again. The people there somehow got in this photograph, but it doesn't show them the activity they were actually doing. They were actually fishing on the river. We are salmon people. Salmon is one of our staple foods, and we haven't been able to fish for about 5 years now because of the depletion of the resources. And the fish farms on the Pacific West Coast are bringing diseases and fish lice and all kinds of horrible things, and they're infecting our own wild fish. Okay, next one. Everybody looks sad there. And the reason for that is because an anthropologist took the picture and wanted them to dress up this way. The man there is a well-known orator. His name was Chief Technitza. And on that side of him is his wife. And I'm not sure who these two ladies are. They may be sisters, or one is a daughter and one is a sister, I think. But the regalia that's on here is somewhat indicative of the clothing that we wore a long time ago. Most of our food was, our clothing was made from many different materials. Hides of animals were one of them because they were so resilient. We have a plant called Indian hemp, and certain materials are made from that. And then if you were very, very poor or an unlucky hunter, then you would take the striated sagebrush and pound it and make it into a softer fabric that you could weave for clothing. Okay? This is indicative of the basketry that my grandmother made. She was what we call a master basket maker. And that basket on the top is more closely related to our neighbors because the slats are wider. But these two baskets, the one on the far left and the bottom right, that's called the coiled basket method. And I found that method is used in many countries, in Africa in particular. Of course, in the southern United States, I've seen it, but I've also seen other types of basketry. But the designs you see on the baskets are particular hallmarks of a particular weaver. Okay? Here's a picture of the late Dr. Darrell Posey with some of his little friends in the Amazon. And this was, I think, well before he passed away. Okay? This was the group of, most of the group of the indigenous people that were part of the development of the Code of Ethics. The big lady in the back there, that's me. So some people I remember, some I can't. This is Maui Solomon. He is an indigenous lawyer from New Zealand. He had a large part to play in. Is that going to work? Okay. Okay. Oh, I see. See, there's Dr. Maui. There's me. There's my husband. This, I think it's Christine Kabui. She's been a long-standing member since the beginning of the Ethnobiology Congress. This is Dr. Yirin Lin from Taiwan and one of his master students who I adopted as my nephew. His name is Lehui. This is Dr. Kelly Bannister. She and this lady over here, I can't remember her name, and this lady were some of the academic people that worked with us to cobble together this Code of Ethics. Okay, next one. This was taken at the Congress in Uganda. There's Dr. Kabui again, Dr. Zemedi from Ethiopia, the president of the university, Dr. Karim Ali Kassam. Dr. Kassam is doing some incredible work in the Pamir Mountains of Afghanistan. And actually, while he was there, his sister was there as a nurse and was murdered by the people. But he really brought to mind what climate change is doing to us. And he says, according to the studies that have been done, we are past the point of no return if we don't change things quickly, because all we have left now is hope. These are some of the students that were in the emerging ethnobotany workshop. Canadian, too many Canadians in there anyway. We seem to have a little Canadian mafia going on with all the positions we've been taking up. Are there any more photos? This was also, oh, sorry, next one. This is me with the medicine man and his 2 wives. We went to visit them in Lake Bunyoni and had a very interesting time with him. Next. That's me taking the virtual medicine of the medicine man. Next. And these are some of the countries that are attending or that are part of the Congress. Does anybody know which flag this is? I was told to ask you that to make sure I was honest. Yeah. This is the Canadian flag, which should be up here actually, because we do hold the power of the mafia right now. Next. And that's the last one. So do you have